Things were looking up to the most part. However, with the direction of the grumps they were heading in, they most likely end up in Royal Woods, meaning sooner or later they had to go up battling within the group. Hopefully it would be easy be later, and the large mass was only moving as fast as the slow one. Brock only had time to gather up everyone in the schools and prepare them for war. They were going to fight like hell. Stan was in deep sleep, dreaming of what his life was like before the world went to shit. He and his family were all in the dining room, sitting around the table about to eat dinner. His mom and sister were alive, and even his dad and younger brother were back. Nothing bad had ever happened to them. Everything was back to normal. He was back to being happy. His mom came over and set a plate on the table that was covered by a metal dome. He wanted to see what she made. Her meals were the best. Just then Stan cut off a whiff of something putrid. It smelled like rotting garbage mixed with dead, rotten meat. Stan's face crinkled as the smell got worse. He looked up to see his family, who were all glaring at him, sniffing. Their skin had turned green, eyes were yellow, and their teeth were stained with blood. Stan's mom lifted the dome to reveal the severed head of a kid around his age. Stan wanted to scream, but the sound of it was still trapped in his throat. He began to breathe heavily as he felt a hand placed on his mouth. Suddenly the Stan was surrounded by darkness, and he began to kick and squirm. He saw the face of the darkness. It was eye-wide, and had his finger to his mouth to hush him. Stan instantly recognized the face, and everything came flooding back to him. The face belonged to Speck. Two of them had taken shelter over the mansion several blocks away. One was to be occupied by the kids from Hazel, Kentucky. As soon as they had gotten comfortable, Stan had laid down on the couch and was out like a light bulb in less than a minute. He quickly stopped squirming, and as soon as Speck was for sure he didn't make a sound, he moved his hand away from Stan's mouth. "What is it?" Stan whispered quietly, but apparently not quietly enough that Speck brought his finger back up to his lips more urgently. Stan had shrugged his shoulders in gesture to that. "Well?" Speck leaned in closer to than Stan was comfortable with. "Outside," he said, in the quietest whisper Stan had ever had. "Who, the other kids?" Speck shook his head. "No adults." Stan's spine tingled slightly. That would explain the smell then. "Too many?" he asked. "Too many," Speck replied. "Can you be more specific?" "No, I can't." "What do you mean?" Stan was confused. "Go see for yourself." Speck stepped aside and acknowledged a window which had the curtains were drawn. "Be very, very quiet and careful." Stan nodded and tiptoed over to the curtain and parted them over so slightly, expected to see a few dozen grubs at the most, but he wasn't prepared for what he actually saw. His soul was almost left his body. Stan wouldn't blame it if it did, because it actually made him not want to leave the physical plane of existence as well. As far as Stan could see, the surrounding mansions that spread out through the neighborhood were more greens than he ever seen, well over 1,000 of them. All of them were standing around bunched together, motionless like statues, as if they were waiting for something. Stan slowly closed the curtains and crept back in towards the window. The only sound to be heard was his own heart beating in a mile a minute. As soon as he was right next to Speck, he spoke quieter than he ever had before. "How is this possible? Where did they come from? How did we not see, hear, or smell them until now?" "I don't know," Speck told him. "They probably have been gathering here since before we got here, and while we were sleeping. More and more of them. The last time I checked, they began to appear as if they were drawing them together." "But what?" Stan said. "Like I said before, I don't know. But what I do know is we have to get away from here. Far, far away from here. Maybe back to Royal Woods?" The name Royal Woods had sent a hinge of rage to Stan's mind. That was the last place he wanted to be besides here. He never wanted to see Duke, Joey, or any of those bastards at the elementary school again. And what about the Loud siblings? He hoped they were dead, and if he ever saw them again, he wouldn't be held responsible of what they'd do. He looked over at his mates that were resting again. The couch he was sleeping on, imagined using it as the Loud siblings. He blamed them for everything that happened to him in the last few weeks. He wished that they never showed up at the school, and he wished they were dead. Then another thought, though, Mary. He tried to put her out of her mind. Over the last few days, he couldn't stop thinking about her. She was the only reason why he'd be ever to go back to Royal Woods. Why should we go back there? Stan asked Speck. They guess they don't know about this horde, would they? Speck said as Stan shrugged. I guess so. The two boys packed what they could and quietly crept away from the mansion. Wait, Speck said, which caused Stan to look at them with irritation. What? What about the other kids we saw? He shook his head. No way, dude. I'm not going anywhere near those hooligans. But what if they have younger kids with them? And the other kids who aren't bad, but they are part of that group that they have no one else looking after them. Stan sighed. Fine, but let's make it quick. Speck nodded and they hurried over to the Hazel Kentucky hooligans they were reciting. Stan and Speck slowed down the closer they got to the sounds of mischief and debauchery. They could even hear music. Stan gripped his mace tightly, while Speck patted his jacket with one hand to feel his gun hidden in his pocket, while his hammer was hidden up in the sleeve of his jacket. They were walking steadily now as they were approaching the yard of the mansion. None of the kids had noticed them yet, except for one strange-looking kid who was tall, slender, and wore what looked like a lab coat, pale skin, and shaved head. He looked like someone with the little goth Loud sister would hang out with. Stan and Speck pondered walking over to him and saying something, but decided against it. The kid just watched as they crept by, turning his head like a swivel. It made Stan shudder. Speck, however, had a determined look on his face. The two boys got closer and closer, taking everything in. There were kids who were passed out, kids who were making out, and kids who were chugging what seemed to be like alcohol. Stan could tell that they were where the music was coming from. It was music blasting heavy metal sound from battery-powered boombox, and other kids were banging some sort of worst dancing Stan had ever seen. Ahem, Speck loudly said authoritatively, clearing his throat to get everyone's attention. Everyone stopped what they were doing immediately and turned out to the new arrivals. One kid even turned off the music. Stan was trying his best not to look nervous, but he knew he was failing at it. Who the hell are you? The big kid asked. My name's not important. Just call me Speck. Now, I like to know who's in charge. What is it to ya? Another kid said. I need to talk with whoever's in charge here. It's urgent. Yeah, so this bulge is taken care of. Though said one of the kids was making out with the girl. No, I'm serious, Speck demanded. So am I, the kid retorted. Stan and Speck looked at each other. All Speck could tell on Stan's face was that he wanted to get the heck out of here. But Speck wasn't going to give up that easily. Surely there must be someone in charge, Speck went on. That'd be me, a voice said. Stan and Speck looked over to see a kid, who was slightly shorter than the other kids around him, making his way towards a group of kids. He had shaved his head like the other kid they'd seen earlier, and also wore a dirty gray t-shirt with the word Army printed on it, and long gray pants with too many pockets on them. This kid reminded Stan of the shorter version of Brock Howard, the kid who was in charge of the middle school group in Royal Woods. Now that you guys have to say that's so damn important, but we could stop partying? There was a chorus of yeahs that followed with this question. Stan and Speck were wondering on how small this kid ended up being in charge of the group hard enough, tough looking. But they also wondered how old he was. He passed as a 15-year-old, but you would have to get a good look at him. Well, Speck began, we just came here to warn you. Warn us of what? The kid interrupted. The adults? Don't worry, fellas. I can take care of them ourselves very much. No, you don't understand, Speck continued. We just saw so many of them. How many? The kid asked. I don't know, Speck said. Too many to count. The kid made a dismissive grunt. Whatever. Do you think we can handle ourselves? Is that it? No, it's not that at all. Gage? The kid said. Gage Howard. Howard, thought Stan. This kid has to be related to Brock. Your last name's Howard? Stan asked. That's what I just said, isn't it? You won't believe what happened related to anyone named Brock, would you? Gage glared at Stan suspiciously. Yeah, I have a cousin named Brock. He lives in Royal Woods. Why do you ask? Well, I'm from Royal Woods, and Brock is in charge of a group of kids there, and... Oh, I see how it is, Gage said. Huh? Brock sent you, didn't he? He thinks he can can't look after myself. Thinks I can't lead the group myself. Stan and Speck looked at each other rather confused, then back at Gage, who continued to ramble. He just thinks I'm not strong enough. That's it. That's always has been. My whole life's been known as Brock's cousin, a punny boy who can't look after himself. Well, that ends now. I'll just show him how really tough I am, and I'll do that by beating the shit out of you two. Stan and Speck looked at each other again. Try not to laugh exactly what this little plan's doing is beating them up. Look, buddy, Speck began. Brock didn't send us here. We only came here to warn you about the adults are... Shut it, Gage demanded. I'm sure that's exactly what Brock told you to say. He'll soon see that he can no longer push me around. Stan sighed. What are you trying to do? We're both twice your size, dude. Gage smiled. I don't have to beat you up. I could just have someone do it for me. Stan and Speck looked around her with grinning faces. Stan was gripping back with his mace, while Speck could feel his gun and hammer practically begging to be taken out and used to threaten these kids. But he had to wait. Not yet, he told himself. Oh yeah, Stan said. And who exactly do you plan on using getting your message across with? Gage smiled wider and turned around and towards it. Hank, Hawk, get your asses over here. As soon as he was done shouting, there was movement from what Stan and Speck originally thought it was a pile of candy wrappers. Two big kids suddenly arose from the pile, causing the wrappers to both slide away. One of them was a brown-skinned and dark hair covering eyes, while another one had light brown skin, brown hair that was in the style of a mohawk, and was missing a front tooth. What do you want? The brown-skinned said, one groggily. We're trying to sleep. Whatever, Gage said, then pointed back to Stan and Speck. You see these kids over there? They were talking shit about you. They were just saying they could beat you up and you were both chickens. What? Both boys said at once. They don't look so tough to me, the boy said with a mohawk as he brought the fist to the palm of his hand. Then why don't you teach them a lesson? Gage said. The two boys smiled. This is bullshit, Stan cried, trying his best not to sound scared. Speck, on the other hand, remained calm. This is just a huge misunderstanding, he said. We don't want to fight. We're only here to warn you about the grown-ups. You see what I mean? Gage said. They think we can't handle a few measly grown-ups. You two just make the biggest mistakes of your life, said the brown-skinned one. Stan recognized the two boys, Hawk and Hank. Hank was brown-skinned with dark hair, and Hawk was the light-skinned tone with the mohawk. They both terrorized Royal Woods during Halloween last year and stole several kids' candy bags. Luckily, the Loud family was able to scare the crap out of them by tricking them into going into Lucy's scary corn maze. Once they were gone, Lincoln and Clyde gave everyone their own candy since the two bullies ate everyone else's candy. Stan then shook his head. He was about to get the hit beat out of him. Why was thinking about the Loud family? He held up his mace in defensive stage as Gage ordered some of the kids to take it from him. A kid snuck up behind Stan and stole his mace. Hey! He cried. He was now defenseless. He then looked over to Speck, who told the other kids to surround him, and he didn't even have a weapon. He showed them his empty pockets, and they were satisfied. They didn't know his jacket had a secret pocket that had his gun, or had a hiding hammer in one of his sleeves. Idiots. Gage had ordered the kids to escort Stan and Speck and pick the field at the middle of the yard, where they would have plenty of room to fight, so everyone could get a good look. What are we going to do? Stan asked Speck as they were being held. Where they were going to fight. I guess we'll have to fight, Speck told him. Do you have any fighting experience? My mom made me take karate when I was younger, Stan said. And I cried on my first day at the karate studio. We never went back. Nice, Stan sarcastically said. What about you? Stan asked. I'm not too bad at dodging and evading. Dodging won't help if we can't fight, Stan said bitterly. Speck just shrugged. Soon everyone stopped and began to huddle around the combatants, ready to witness the carnage that was about to be unfold. So, do you plan on using that thing? Stan asked, acknowledging the gun in Speck's pocket. Soon. How soon is soon? Soon. Stan and Speck were now facing Hawk and Hank, both grinning. They were ready to pound in them some faces. Stan was going to fight Hank, and Speck was going to fight Hawk. It doesn't have to be this way, Speck said as he turned to Gage. We can all just leave this place and team up with the kids from Royal Woods and beat these grown-ups. Oh, I plan to go to Royal Woods later, Gage said. Right after we done get the beating the shit out of you, and then beating the shit out of the grown-ups that you said we can't handle. Speck sighed. Ding, ding, Gage yelled, and signaled for the fight to begin. Stan held his fists out pathetically as Hank advanced on him. He closed his eyes and swung down at the larger kid, who just knocked his arm away and clocked him to the left side of his face, sending flashes of pain throughout his head and cheers within the crowd. Stan managed to stay on his feet. However, he tried to take another swing, only for the same thing to happen. Meanwhile, Hawk had advanced on Speck and was throwing punches that Speck was effortlessly dodging, which pissed Hawk off. Hold still, damn it, he growled. I don't want to fight, Speck told him. Hawk looked over to see Hank going off on Stan. He was having way much better luck than Hawk was, which pissed him off even more. Hank, you want to trade? No way, man, Hank responded. I'm way having too much fun with this dude. Stan hit Hank, which closed in a fight, but it didn't do much. Other than made him angrier, he punched Stan again, this time knocking Stan flat. Stan known that looking at it was risky, imagining the family looking down closer to him, getting his ass beat by some punk, which caused the rage to boil inside him. Hank came into view and stood over him, smiling. Stan raised a leg and kicked him in the groin, only to end up kicking something hard and plastic. Nice try, Hank laughed, but I'm always prepared for a strike for the junk. He knocked on his jockstrap through his jeans, and then sat on top of Stan and began to pulverize him even more. Stan! Speck cried, as he watched his fighting partner mercilessly getting punched in the face. He not only looked away for a second, but it gave Hawk all the instinctive to bum rush him. Speck had turned and looked back at Hawk, who was still charging him like a bull. He knew what he had to do. Speck had fell to his knees, and he flung his arm, which caused the hammer to eject out of his sleeve. It caught the hammer by the grip and swung as hard as he could towards Hawk's knee. Luckily for Speck, Hawk wasn't wearing any knee pads. There was a snapping sound as the head of the hammer made contact with Hawk, cried out in pain as he collapsed to the ground, cradling around his wounded knee. Hank heard his friend cry out and looked to see his friend in excruciating pain. Hawk? Hank said with concern in his voice, forgetting all about Stan. Stan was suddenly regained his senses and noticed Hank's close friend to his face. An idea popped in his head and seized for the moment. He had brought up and bit down on Hank's right thumb. Now it was Hank who was crying out in pain. He yelped as he delivered blows to Stan's head, but Stan was just ended up biting down harder and harder. Blood began to fill his mouth as he pierced the skin, continuing to bite all the way down to the bone. Hank was screaming incoherently. He wanted beg Stan to stop, but the pain was too great. All he could do was scream. Stan began to grind his teeth onto the bone as hard as he could as soon as the thumb was severed. Stan held up the thumb against the roof of his mouth. With his tongue, he felt Hank's weight shift off of him. Hank was now writhing in pain on the ground, and Stan rose to a sitting position and spat out the thumb as well as some bile as he coughed hysterically. Everyone who was standing around began to cry at what they just witnessed. Speck shoveled over to Stan, who helped him to his feet. It was clear that the fight was over. Took you long enough, Stan croaked. His body was bloodied and bruised. Sorry, I didn't want to hurt anyone, Speck had told him. Stan just glared at him. What the fuck was that? Gage shouted. Why do you still have weapons? Speck shrugged. Guess you aren't as clever as you think. Gage clenched his fist and looked down at Hank and Hawk, who were both still crying. Useless idiots, he spat before looking at everyone who was around him. All of you, take this hammer and beat them until the bones in their bodies are shattered. Several kids began to advance towards Stan and Speck. The two boys had looked at each other, and Speck knew what he had to do. He quickly pulled a gun from his pocket and fired a round into the air. Everyone flinched and put their hands to their eyes. What the actual hell? Gage yelled. Where did you? Shut up! Speck demanded, finally losing his cool, pointing the gun at everyone and pointed at their hands, backed away as the barrel whisked past them. I came out here for the goodness part of my heart to warn you about the group of grown-ups, and I saw how you repay me by trying to beat the ever-living shit out of me and my friend. Bullshit, Gage said. I knew it was Brock who was convinced you to make me join you, and his group asked. And you can't make me. Speck pointed the gun and Gage fired, missing his head by only a few centimeters. Gage was so shocked that he didn't even flinch. He just stood there, eyes wide, mouth hanging open. I don't even know, Brock, Speck shouted. I don't even care where you think I'm here. You can either come with me and be away from this place and away from the grown-ups, or you can stay here and be ripped to pieces until they finally showed up. What is it going to be? No one said anything. The only sounds that filled the air were sounds of Hank and Hawk sobbing. Well? Gage regained his composure and his face turned cold and angry again. Fuck you, he said. Really? Speck countered, still pointing the gun at Gage, who began to walk up to him. Don't make me shoot you. If you were going to shoot me, you would have done it already, Gage said with a smile formed on his face. Well then, give me a good reason to. I've given you plenty of good reasons to. He turned and told the other kids to take his gun, but no one did any of you. Why aren't you any of you listening? He's not going to kill you. I don't have to kill them, Speck said. I just have to shoot them. And in the proper treatment with medicine, they'll end up dying. Maybe in a few weeks, hours, maybe a few days or a few weeks, if any of them live that long. But if they say they do, it'll be the worst of weeks of their lives. Everyone continued to look at each other, too afraid to do anything. Now, are you going to come with me? Or am I just going to waste my time? A few kids looked like they wanted to leave, but they were too afraid to say anything. Speck then looked at Gage, who seemed to be getting angrier and angrier with each passing second, until he finally shouted, Screw you! Is that the only insult you could think of? Speck asked him. That was all he shouted. Some more was the same thing. I guess so, Speck shouted. Then Gage continued to shout, You know what? I'll show you that we can look after ourselves by start taking on the group of grown-ups by ourselves. What? Speck said. You couldn't possibly. Everyone grab your weapons and follow me. Everyone was hesitant to do as they were told. Now, Gage barked, as everyone sprang into motion. What about them? A kid asked, pointing at Hawk and Hank, who were still crying over their injuries. Leave them, but they're nothing but a couple of chickens. Speck threatened Gage with the gun again. Stop, he ordered. You don't know what you're getting yourselves into. Gage ignored him and grabbed a wooden club with spikes sticking out of it. I said stop. Or what, you'll shoot me? Gage sneered. Speck didn't respond. That's what I thought. Soon Gage and his gang were heading towards the town that Speck had warned them about. Let's just get them out of here, Stan said to Speck, and his group tried to trudge them along. No, Speck said. I'm going to follow them. Are you serious? Why would you do that? We need to get the heck out of here. I'm going to follow them, Speck repeated. Hopefully once they see the large group of adults, they'll realize their mistake and come back to us to Royal Woods. Why would you even want them to us at Royal Woods at this point? Because I have a feeling that group of grown-ups are going to move on eventually, and they might head up somewhere in Royal Woods. And if that happens, then those kids at the schools are going to need all the help they can get. Stan nodded and looked back at Hank and Hawk. What about them? Speck looked at the two boys. Hank was holding his thumb, trying to put it back in his hand that would magically reattach itself, and Hawk was still holding his knee, bawling his eyes out. Speck sighed. We'll come back for them. Gage and his group were marching on, ready for the battle, ready to take on the world no matter how big it is. Stan and Speck were slowly sauntering on the end of the group. Stan got his mace back and was holding it like the most precious thing in the world to him, while Speck was holding his gun with his right hand and his hammer on his left. Every now and then they spotted a random grown-up and just take it down, causing a wave of cheers to erupt from the group. I'll show them, Gage kept telling himself. I'll show them that I'm stronger than I look. I'll take down these adults and then go back bragging to Brock about my accomplishment. Up ahead, someone shouted. Gage looked to see a group of adults at the end of the street, facing something that was obscured a large mansion. Kill them all, Gage demanded. He and the others began to advance on the adults. Stan and Speck stopped. They knew they were here. No doubts the adults that were part of the large group. They could all do now was watch and wait for Gage to realize that his group was outmatched. The group was taking it to the adults, with the force reckoned to be with first. The Hazel Kentucky kids slashing and hacking down loads of grown-ups. Ooh, this is too hard, Gage joked. You guys were right. We couldn't handle this group. Stan and Speck waited for Gage to realize just how large this group of grown-ups were. He was obvious, but not a care in the world. He wanted to do was carry every last one of the grown-ups. Let's go, he shouted. Is that all you got? Still Stan and Speck were waiting. Hurry up already, Speck moaned as Gage's group continued to go down. Stan was getting impatient, so he soon turned to Speck and told him they should just leave the jerks until they suddenly felt cold, dead hands clasped around his neck. He didn't have the chance to say anything as he was dragged away from Speck, who flinched as Stan pulled away from him. Stan! He yelled as Stan being slammed to the ground by a diseased male. Speck took a glance at Gage's group, who were still in the constant motion. Obvious to what was going on, he swore and he gripped the hammer, took a swing at the adult, bashing his brains in, and then he helped Stan shove it off of him and helped him back up. Thanks, he said, struggling to catch his breath. Speck was about to say you're welcome, but suddenly something made him say, it's not over yet. Stan looked to see more greens approaching from the side. There was no way Gage or his group could see the greens as they were obstructed by a large mansion as well. Gage! Speck yelled, but he and his group were so distracted by the fight. The grown-ups were getting closer. We need to run, Stan shouted, as he looked as he was already running a marathon. Speck swore and aimed his gun at the closest adult and fired. The gunshot altered Gage and his group. Run! Speck shouted. A lot of the kids were confused and saw that Speck was pointing at something that they couldn't see. Gage was about to swear at him when he suddenly saw a huge set of adults came into view. Too many to fight. He was suddenly overflowing with panic. He finally realized that they were outmatched and he yelled at the others to run, and they wasted no time. They ran as fast as they could, many bumping into each other and knocking themselves over. Some were fast enough to pull out by the large bodies. Their screams were loud at first, they were muffled. Stan was then afraid of everyone else. Close behind Speck was not running as far as intentionally, just to make sure the others didn't fall behind. Gage and the others finally caught up to them. The look of fear was evident in his face, and then he looked at Speck and said, You were right. Speck was above saying, I told you so, but he was definitely mad at Gage for leading some of his group members to their deaths after he warned them. Stan continued to run faster as everyone else. Luckily, the others easily outrun the pursuing adults as well. They were now running past the mansion Gage and his group were hanging out at. Wait, Speck cried out. We need to go get Hawk and Hank. Screw them, Gage said. They're no use to us injured. Speck swore at him, but Gage and the others continued to follow Stan to Royal Woods. He decided to go back for himself. He made his way past some of the brick walls and hedges obstructed by the view in his backyard of the mansion. He was now in the yard and dead in his tracks when he saw something that had beat the two boys throughout the entire lawn of the mansion were nothing but grown-ups. Where did these come from? He wondered. He slowly backed away, knowing that Hawk and Hank were most likely dead, but he needed to get confirmation somehow. He climbed a nearby tree and scanned the area. That's when he saw him. Standing over everyone else was a severed leg in one hand and a sledgehammer in the other was a tower. Speck swore at himself. He let the tower's group right to Gage's group. Speck looked at his left and saw the other adults approaching, still too many to count. He quickly climbed down the tree and continued to stand and engage in the others, wondering what was going to happen if the large adults ran into the tower and into the group. He wondered if they had time to fight each other, ignore each other, or team up together. No time to think about it now. They had to get to Royal Woods and warn the kids about the approaching horde. The sun was beginning to set, but the day was far from over. Chris was in a deep sleep. He had crashed completely. Over the last few hours that had happened upon loads of drugs hidden away in the mansion he was staying at. Rich assholes buying stupid things, he thought. Then after a brief consideration to try out the drugs for himself. At first he was on cloud 9, felt powerful and felt invincible. Felt like the strongest man on earth. Nothing could touch him. And all the drugs wore off as he was back to reality. He needed to go to sleep, and he was dreaming about the clouds. Looking down at everyone, when a voice was heard. Crony's voice. Chris, we heard something. Something loud in the distance. A bang, maybe? Maybe it was a gunshot. Chris ignored him for a few seconds later. Crony spoke again. We heard another one. Something is definitely firing a gun somewhere. Should we do something? Chris didn't respond. He just wanted to enjoy his dream. After a few minutes later, Crony spoke again more urgently. Kids! There are kids here. Trying to attack us. They don't know who or what they're dealing with. That finally caused Chris to mumble a response. Then kill them for crying out loud, so I can get to sleep. Gladly, Crony responded. You heard him. Kill them all. After a few seconds, Crony later spoke up again. It's working. They're no match for us. They're running away scared. Should we go after them? Sure, whatever, Chris mumbled some more. You heard the man. After them. After a few seconds later. Whoa, Chris, there's another group of adults. Apparently this one has a leader too. Chris didn't even know what to make of this information. We'll take him out. There's only one room for one leader, and that is me. He's a big man, Crony went on. He's actually impressed by the size of the group. He's willing to join forces with us. Will you accept your leader? Well, in that case, a few minutes later. Chris, I'm sorry to report this, but the kids got away. No matter, Chris continued to mutter. They'll get theirs. Every kid will get what's coming to them eventually. But for now, I just want to rest up for another day, and then we'll move on. Are you sure? Crony asked. Yes. After all, what a difference does a day make?